Hi, Leanne.
Hi, Bob.
How you doing?
Good. How are you?
I am excellent. Let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright. This is the Wright Show. You are Liane Young at Boston College. You're a professor of psychology, and you do work in moral psychology, which is a really fertile field right now. There's a lot going on, and you run something called the Morality Lab there at BC, and you've done some really interesting work. And I'm very much looking forward to this conversation. Um, I want to start out with a study of yours that got a fair amount of publicity, I guess, within the last couple of years that sheds a certain amount of light on the psychology of group conflict, you might say. You studied two groups of people who are at odds with one another, Palestinians and Israelis on the one hand, and Republicans and Democrats on the other. And I think one reason this is interesting to me is because it suggests, something I've always thought to be the case, which is that, what you could, people use the word tribalism to, tribal conflict, and I've always thought that the parts of the mind that abet tribal conflict abet all kinds of group conflict, ranging from ideological to ethnic to nationalistic and so on. And I think, this study of yours suggests as much. But anyway, you had a really interesting finding. Why don't you tell us what you were looking for and what you found?
Yeah, so the basic question that we were after was how people on either side of a group boundary think about their own minds and motivations as opposed to the minds and motivations of the folks on the other side. And so, in particular, we took two sets of groups, like you mentioned, so American Democrats and Republicans, and Israelis and Palestinians in the Middle East. And so, the guiding hypothesis was that people would think very differently about their own motivations for their role in the conflict as opposed to the other side's motivations. So, we went in thinking that Democrats would think that their involvement or their aggression would be motivated for their love or loyalty for the folks on their side. And then the Republicans would be motivated by the Republicans' hatred of the Democrats, right? And same goes for the folks in the Middle East. And that's pretty much the pattern that we found.
Uh huh. So, so if I'm a Republican, I don't see myself as hating Democrats nearly to the extent that I see Democrats as hating me.
Exactly. So there's so we call this a bias in some sense because it seems like Republicans, when they're thinking about Democrats' motivations, are in capturing what Democrats think that they are motivated by, and vice versa, right? And so it's interesting because what we didn't measure was sort of a ground truth of actual or true motivations on each side, but we did look to see whether, say, my perception of your motivation matches up with your perception of your motivation,
Right.
and vice versa.
So it could be that some of them are right about one thing or another, but it couldn't be that they're all right about everything, right? I mean,
Exactly. Yeah.
so
Because there's this basic mismatch. Yeah.
and on that point, I noticed just in glancing at your graphs that in the Palestinian-Israeli case, there was a different kind of asymmetry, right? Which was that okay, so you did have the basic finding, which was that on both sides they were at least somewhat more likely to see themselves as motivated by love, I guess, than the other side. But you did find Palestinians more inclined to say that other Palestinians were motivated by hatred than Israelis were to say that other Israelis were motivated by hatred, right?
Yeah, that's right. So exactly what you said, that Palestinians seem to show a reduced asymmetry insofar as they seem to be a little bit more willing to attribute their own behaviors to hatred compared to Israelis. So Israelis say that they are way more motivated by in-group love than out-group hate, whereas the difference for Palestinians seems to be reduced. And that's not something that we predicted. So we didn't expect to find this difference between the groups, and we didn't find a sort of similar difference in the American Republicans and Democrats. But we have a few thoughts as to what could be going on there.
And just to be clear, in the case of the Republicans and Democrats, there was no such asymmetry. I mean, they were roughly equal in terms of the extent to...
Exactly.
Yeah, okay.
Exactly. So, I mean, just to speculate wildly here, it could be the case that this difference between the groups is due to the difference in the power structure in that particular intergroup conflict. So it could be the case that if you are a member of a group that is disempowered, that you think that it is more legitimate for you to be acting out because of your attitudes towards the group that is in power, right? And a lot of other researchers have also found some interesting asymmetries and how, in particular, Israelis and Palestinians think about their own motivations versus the motivations on the other side, and also that there are possibly different kinds of interventions that might be effective in addressing that intergroup conflict because of the difference in the power structure. So.
Yeah, there is an asymmetry of circumstance. I mean, I've been to both the West Bank and Israel, and, in the West Bank, the perception of it's the instruments of the Israeli state that are governing you, and, soldiers come into the town and they have a certain kind of power and so on, and whereas with Israel, the fear is a little different. It's, there's the isolated terrorist event, there's and then the Gaza's a little different from the West Bank and so on, but they're not symmetrical situations. But I'm wondering what kind of comparable, how would you follow up if you were looking to decide whether asymmetry of power is the key thing here? I'm trying to think of comparable situations around the world, and nothing's exactly coming to mind.
I mean, the experiment that I would love to run would happen maybe now and then again after our election, right? So we could see, we could test this same sort of hypothesis in American Democrats and Republicans. It's possible that we won't get the same effect because what's happening in the Middle East is sort of a chronic problem, whereas, with the election, that after 4 or 8 years, things are going to change up again, possibly. But we could still see, depending on who wins the election, you're either in power or you're part of the group that's in power or you're not. And so that said, it also seems intuitive to me that the conflict is more salient leading up to the election than after the election. It's possible that after the election, people sort of make peace with what's happening, at least for a little bit. So I'd actually be really curious to see what happens pre and post.
You also have the problem that in American politics, it's rarely the situation that power is highly,
Sure.
it's I think usually not the case that a single party controls the presidency, the House, and the Senate. But I guess if you measured relative effects before and after an election where there's been at least some relative shift of power, I guess. Of course, that's still very different from the situation in Israel-Palestine, where on the one hand you're worried about terrorists coming in and killing you, and on the other hand you're worried about soldiers who can come in and do anything they want to you, so more or less. So these are very different. These are very different things.
Yeah, it is interesting. There's certainly a lot of other differences between what's going on in the States and what's going on in the Middle East that we didn't even necessarily examine. So, for instance, it might be the case that Americans don't think that party loyalty is a super legitimate motivator, right? For us, we were thinking, of course, in-group love is better and more legitimate than out-group hate. But when it comes down to it, I think that Americans want to think of themselves as being motivated by certain ideals and principles and not just party loyalty, right?
And of course, there is the question of whether in-group love, in a certain sense, is better than out-group hate. I know Paul Bloom, whom I'm sure you've come into contact with, is working on a book and has talked about this to a certain extent. That the tagline is against empathy, I guess, but the idea is that these kind of warm, fuzzy impulses have a dark side, which is that they can unite a group in the service of hostility.
Oh, absolutely. And that's something that we've looked at also, in particular in the context of whistleblowing, right? So there are certain cases when in-group loyalty can be really damaging, that when you are driven by nothing else than loyalty to your own group, then you might neglect other moral ideals like justice and fairness and so on.
Mm-hmm. Now, one finding of yours that kind of surprised me is that you can actually influence you might say even correct a bias of perception, I guess, or at least influence the perception by offering monetary rewards,
Mm-hmm.
right? Now, you only did that in the context of the Democrats and the Republicans, is that right?
That's right.
So how did that work?
Yeah, so we incentivize our participants online by telling them that they would receive an extra monetary bonus if they got the answer right. So if they were able to accurately estimate the motivations on the other side. So if I'm a Democrat and I'm able to capture what a Republican thinks that he is motivated by, then I'll get an extra bonus for completing the task. And so what we found was that people are actually incentivized to get the answer right, as it were. Again, like, as I said before, we're not necessarily capturing any sort of ground truth here. So it's not the case that I get a bonus for guessing what you were actually motivated by. I just get a bonus for guessing what you think you are motivated by. Right. And so this could mean a couple of things. This could mean that when I said that you are motivated by outgroup hate before, that I'm just, motivated to say that you're bad and I'm good because you're on the other side, that I don't actually think that you're motivated by hatred, but I sort of want to think that because you're not on my team and I want to sort of denigrate you. So that's one possibility, right? Because when you pay me to get it right, then I actually get it right. But another possibility, as other research in cognitive science shows, is that when I get paid for getting the answer right, I'm just a little bit more motivated to do well. I pay more attention to the task. I read the question more carefully, and maybe I anchor differently. So who knows? We're still trying to get after the mechanism of what exactly is going on here.
And so, again, I guess I missed this, but what you said was that we'll give you money if your assessment matches the assessment of the other side?
Exactly.
Okay.
Right.
So right. So
you tell the experimenter what you're motivated by, and then I tell the experimenter what you think you're motivated by, and if those answers match, then I get the bonus.
So they were kind of two different questions, right? I mean, in the first question, they're saying, "What do you think Republicans are motivated by?" And in the second question, you're offering to give them money for correctly guessing what Republicans will say they're motivated by?
Oh, sorry, no. So that's just,
okay.
The second thing is just the inference that we're making, right? We're just asking them, what do you think Republicans are motivated by?
Okay.
But the way that we score it is
so they're just less likely. Okay, great.
Exactly.
So that's what you mean. You're not matching their answer with anything that's supposed to represent anything. You're just comparing it to what their answer without a reward is. It seems to me there's a third possibility, which is that they're just trying to game the system. They're thinking, okay, these are like these liberal researchers or whatever, or these whatever researchers, right? Whatever preconception is in their mind, and like they want X, right? That's always a possibility with something like this, right?
Sure. Although it's worth noting that we don't find differences for our Republican and Democrat participants, right?
Okay, they're equal. So that's not the kind. So it probably wouldn't be an ideological preconception per se. Yeah.
Yeah, you might think a Republican coming to the study would have that sort of impression, and be more motivated to sort of game the system, right?
Yeah. I mean, the reason it surprises me that money would influence them significantly is that when I ask why is this, that there is this asymmetry in the first place, that Democrats and Republicans, view the other so differently from the way they view themselves, I would guess that the human mind is designed by natural selection to get you to, maybe the ultimate goal is to get you to say certain things about the enemy, and in order to say them persuasively, you need to believe them. But in any event, I would think that this is a mechanism of genuine self-deception, right? I mean, I would guess that it would run pretty deep, and so it's a little surprising that that there would be the effect. Were you surprised?
Yeah, I mean, we were a little bit surprised that money is what ended up being the most effective incentive. So we're in the process of trying a number of other seemingly more legitimate interventions. So, for instance, giving and we, again, some of this is in progress, but giving American Democrats and Republicans the results that we got from our participants in the Middle East, so that maybe if that there are conflicts happening in these other contexts and that people are biased in just this sort of way, then you can guard against that same bias in yourself. That doesn't seem to work quite as well as paying people the bonus. So that's something that we found pretty surprising. I think to your general point that you'd think this would be a pretty deep-seated bias for various adaptive reasons. It is, but at the same time, I think it's also incredibly adaptive to be able to reason accurately about your enemy's mental states and motivations, right? So to be able to interact with them, to be able to interact strategically with the folks on the other side, you need to be able to accurately capture their motivations. So, that could be thinking accurately about whether they are motivated by their aggression toward you, or whether they're actually motivated by something else entirely. And that might determine, your next move.
That's interesting. I mean, it raised the possibility that we actually have kind of two modes. It's like, if we're believing something just for the purposes of saying it, it's like, what would you tell your friends about Republicans? If that's the mode they're in, it's like, well, when I'm with my friends, we say that they're horrible people, and I mean, they're not thinking that explicitly, but the mind is in that mode. There's a mode for kind of public relations, you might say, but then there's also maybe a situation where you go, okay, now we're actually in a strategic interaction with these people, and it's in our interest to understand them. And again, that's not necessarily explicit, but maybe there are triggers in the mind that get you to shift into a clearer frame. And when you give people money, it shifts them into that frame. So there could be this like dual mode built into the mind.
I think that's exactly right. And this particular set of studies on the motive attribution asymmetry is part of a broader project that we're pursuing, looking at how people think about the minds of others in the context of competition, including intergroup competition and cooperation, right? So decades of research in social psychology suggest that all we do is dehumanize outgroup members, right? In this motivated cognition sort of way that you're talking about, because we want to be able to beat up the people on the other side. In order to do that, we need to think of them as less than human. And part of what that means is thinking that they don't have minds, they don't have complex feelings or belief states and so on. But we also need to be able to be strategic and interact and be competitive. Like in a game of chess, right? You need to be able to anticipate what your opponent is going to do. And so there are many instances, and in fact, the instances in which researchers have been successful in seeing effective behavioral prediction in non-human primates are in these competitive contexts, right? And so recently we've begun to see that, in fact, brain regions help us distinguish between these different kinds of contexts, theory of mind or thinking about the minds of others in competitive and cooperative contexts.
Right. So theory of mind's an interesting thing. It refers to the kind of apparently kind of built-in machinery for thinking about what other people are thinking, right?
Exactly.
And in fact, is it still thought that a deficiency in this may account for Asperger's or anything on that spectrum? Is that at one time that was the thinking, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, autism spectrum disorders are incredibly complex, but this seems to be one key facet, and also something that we've done some work looking at. So, for instance, there's this one brain region that's part of a whole network of brain regions that accomplishes theory of mind or thinking about what other people are thinking. And so in one of our recent studies, we looked at how this one region helps us do this task, both in neurotypical adults and also high-functioning adults with autism. And it turns out that the pattern in this region looks very different for, again, individuals with autism and neurotypical individuals in just the sort of way that you predict.
Okay, and then you also presumably find a lot of interaction between the theory of mind. I mean, I don't know if you've actually done the brain scan studies, but presumably the theory of mind kind of module, so to speak, or network is very much involved in moral, in the attribution of motivation to people that has moral consequence, the attribution to enemies, the attribution to friends.
Exactly. Yeah. So when we scan people's brains as they are engaged in these competitive or cooperative contexts, what we see, sort of interestingly, is that these regions are robustly recruited, right? They come online when people are competing or cooperating with other people. But that the spatial pattern of activity with this brain region actually encodes information about whether you are in competition mode or cooperation mode, right? So at a finer grain, there is information in these regions for theory of mind for whether you and I are engaging in competition or cooperation.
So you can look at a brain scan. When you say think about what's motivating this person, you can look at a brain scan and tell whether they're thinking about the person as an enemy or an ally?
So let me put this in the concrete experimental terms. So let's say you and I are subjects in the experiment. We're playing a game that's modeled after rock, paper, scissors. We call it shapes because there's that. So in rock, paper, scissors, it's only competition mode, right? I'm always trying to win at zero sum, right? If I'm rock and you're scissors, then I beat you, vice versa. We can't both win. We can't both lose. In our game, subjects are incentivized on every single trial. So let's say you and I are playing the game. On one trial, we're cooperating with each other, so we both have to guess the same shape. So if you and I both guess circle, then we both win $1 on that trial. On other trials, we have to both guess different shapes. So if you pick square and I pick circle, then we both win, right? So that's cooperation. We both win and we both lose together.
Right.
In competition mode, it's like rock, paper, scissors. Only one of us can win. So my goal is to say match you. Your goal is to mismatch me. We have different goals. You win, I lose, vice versa. And so what we do is we scan people's brains as they are interacting with the same partner over the course of maybe an hour in this task. And what happens is that for both cooperation and competition, subjects are robustly engaged in theory of mind. We see all of these regions in this same network being recruited. But what I was saying before is that there's information in the spatial pattern of activity within these regions that can tell us, the experimenters, whether they are engaged in cooperation mode or competition mode.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
I wonder if placing people in those modes would, if after that, we are placed in a sheerly zero-sum situation for like an hour, and then after that they ask me to make some moral judgment about you. If my moral judgment about you is, like whether I'm attributing something to, I attribute it to love or hate, or whether that's influenced by the situation I've been put in with you.
Yeah, I think that's totally fascinating. I think context definitely matters, and what we're showing here in this experiment is that context is all that matters, essentially, right? Because in the case of intergroup conflict, whether we're talking about American politics or the Middle East, there are many, many countless factors that determine differences, right? Like whether we know each other, whether we like each other, whether we're on the same team, whether we know the same people. But here we've stripped down all of that, right? So it's not about the individual people, it's just about the game context. But I think it'd be really interesting, like you're saying, to see, if you're interacting with someone over the course of an hour, all of a sudden you're in cooperation mode, are you able to switch, and is that switching, maybe easier in one direction or the other?
Right.
Yeah.
So.
But I mean, yeah.
Go ahead.
I think you're right that the key question is figuring out, what is that difference that these brain regions are picking up on, right? Like, is it something like in-group love and out-group hate, right? When I think about mental states in cooperation mode versus competition mode, one thing that we've done looking at how people think about the minds of groups is to actually put people in cooperation mode or competition mode. So again, say you and I are thinking about each other's minds. If I'm a subject and I'm asked to predict what you're going to do next or predict what you're going to say next, of course that could be the case in cooperation or competition mode, but it's very often the case, say if we're competing, that I need to predict what you're going to do in chess or rock, paper, scissors. Then I'll be more likely to attend to what researchers call these agentic mental states. So thinking about your intentions and plans and agency. But if I'm tasked to be friends with you, to coordinate with you, to form a coalition with you, then I actually think very differently about your mental states. I now think that it's really important for me to understand your feelings and your experiences and your capacity to feel pain and pleasure and so on. So those are very different kinds of mental states. And I could be thinking about the same person or the same group, but focused on very different features of your mind.
And you're probably, I don't know if there's data on this, but you're probably more likely to be accepting of opinions I have or aspects of my culture. Like if we're in that collaborative relationship, like if we're both flying business class, unlikely in my case, but it could happen. And we meet each other and go, and we're both thinking, oh, we could do a deal. We happen to be in the same, this would be great. And then you tell me your religion. I'm probably, whatever your religion is, I'm probably at that moment thinking, what a great religion, right? I mean, it's just intuitively, it seems it works like that. But is there not much data on that?
So is the question whether I am biased, whether I'm biased to sort of favor the subsequent information depending on whether we're competing or cooperating? So whatever I tell you, you're gonna be more favorable towards because we're already cooperating.
Yeah, whether the prior perception that you and I are in a non-zero sum potentially collaborative relationship makes me more inclined to actually feel maybe agreement with opinions you express, like you like this particular baseball player, and I'm going, yeah, or accepting of your religion or some hobby you tell me about. It just seems to me that that's the way it works. Once you think you can do business with somebody, you want to be accepting of them.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a number of interesting questions here. There's the question of whether I am sort of more motivated for even selfish reasons. Like, I think that I can stand to benefit from our interaction, then I better make sure that this interaction is going to be effective. And in order for it to be effective, then I have to like you, right, in order to interact with you. It's funny, though, because when you first gave the example of religion, my immediate intuition was no matter what it is, I'm not going to like it, right? Unless we're of the same religion, just because there are some things about people that are so charged, right, that you might not be able to get over depending on where you're coming from, particularly in the Middle East, right?
Well, right.
So it depends on the stakes, I suppose.
But this gets back, I think, to the question that is kind of floating around in the first study we talked about, which is kind of like, which is the chicken and which is the egg? I mean, mm-hmm. When you look at attitudes between Israelis and Palestinians, I mean, look, you can go back in history when and find periods where there was much more antagonism between Christians and Jews than between Jews and Muslims. There have been mm-hmm. periods in history like that, so it doesn't seem to be anything essential in the religions that govern this. And so I might incline you to ask, well, was it just that in one case they were in some sense, a non-zero-sum situation, and it was in mm-hmm. their interest to get along, and in the other case, it was more like it is in Israel-Palestine now, where there's an argument over land, which is inherently a zero-sum thing, and so I mean, this is my view of things: is that so-called religious conflict is more of like an epiphenomenon. This is kind of a Marxist view in a way, that material circumstances, are the big driver. In this case, I'd say zero-sum and non-zero-sum dynamics being the big driver.
No, you'll have to check back in with me in a couple months, but we have just finished running a study looking at how very young children essentialize religious beliefs as opposed to moral beliefs or preferences or factual beliefs. To what extent do children and adults think of religious beliefs as being biologically guided, stable over time, fixed in people, and how does that determine their attitudes towards these people? So I think it's a really interesting question, right? And one way to get at this question is by looking at very young kids to see what their intuitions are about religion. Sorry.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, going back to that question of whether people receive information differently depending on the context. A study that I was going to bring up earlier, back when we were talking about different power dynamics and power asymmetries in the Middle East versus American politics, is this really interesting study done by Rebecca Sachs and Emil Bruno, looking at how different interventions are differently effective for Palestinians versus Israelis. And I think they also looked at Americans versus Mexican immigrants as a second sample. And what they found, as you might predict, is that perspective taking works really well in some contexts. So say you and I are in a conflict and you're in power and I'm disempowered, then if you want to take my perspective, then that's going to help you understand how to navigate this conflict. But for me, if I'm disempowered, then what really matters for me is to feel like I'm being heard, right? So for me to be able to share my point of view with you, when you understand it, then I feel like I can move beyond the conflict. So I feel like what's interesting to me is that even how information gets processed does depend on the conflict, the context, right? And so whatever information I share with you could be processed differently by you depending on our mode. But even just my feeling like you understand certain aspects of the interaction might matter differently.
That's interesting. So anyway, to get back to the question of what's going on in the brain and the theory of mind network and so on, I mean, the naive assumption might be that when we try to figure out what's going on in somebody's minds, we do it by extrapolation. We say, well, what's going on in my mind in a similar circumstance, or how would I react to that? And in fact, it's commonly, said, when people don't understand somebody, it's like, what's wrong with their mind? They're not putting themselves, just doing this straightforward exercise of saying, well, what would I do if I were in exactly their circumstances? But it seems to be the suggestion of some of your work and other work is that the mind isn't necessarily designed to work that way. The mind is designed to first say, is that a friend or an enemy? And then attribute states of mind to them and motivations to them based on that. And this is a big part of the problem.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's so fascinating. I think it works both ways, because I think there are a lot of instances, and this is the bulk of the work that the folks in my lab have done, where we first think about other people's mental states. So if you put poison in my coffee, did you do it intentionally or accidentally? I need to figure out what's going on in your mind before I can even figure out whether you are a friend or an enemy, right? And then, as you pointed out, there are many other instances in which I first figure out whether you're a friend or an enemy. And then, in retrospect, I think, oh, did you mean to do it? If you're my friend, obviously it was an accident. And I changed the way that I think about your mental states. And I want to talk more about that. But then there's that other thing that you mentioned about how we think about minds, right? So do we do this through a sort of simulation process, egocentric reasoning, or do we have this one theory that we sort of apply to ourselves and other people? And I think the mode of attribution asymmetry work is one great instance in which we most certainly do not reason egocentrically, right? Because if I, as a Democrat, reasoned egocentrically about the Republican, I would think that we're all on the same page. Yeah. We belong to different groups, but we're both motivated by in-group love and in-group loyalty, right? In fact, what I'm doing is I'm attributing just the opposite sort of motive to those on the other side. So the opposite of egocentric reasoning.
Right. So, and of course, I mean, this is just one, we've been talking about one kind of attribution, one thing you might one kind of motivation you might attribute to people, love or hate, but there's a whole literature on attribution and motivation. There's the so-called, it started with the so-called fundamental attribution error, when the initial finding, I guess, was people, in looking at other people, we tend to over-attribute things to just the kind of person they are, so-called disposition, and under-emphasize situation, circumstance, like, well, they were reacting to peer group pressure, blah, blah, blah. Mm-hmm. Turns out it's more complicated than that. It depends on the kind of person, and there may be some question of whether it's a friend or an enemy, and so on.
Yeah, and the nature of the behavior and so on. I mean, I think this is really interesting and complicated, and something that we've thought a little bit about. So one sort of twist on fundamental attribution error that we're finding is that it might matter the kind of internal state that we're talking about. So most of the research on fundamental attribution error is focused on dispositional traits, so character traits. So that person cheated on the test because they're a cheater and not because the test was too hard or because their grandmother got sick the night before, right? Situational stuff. That's all character stuff. But when it comes to internal mental states, we're starting to see a very different kind of asymmetry, namely that we might actually be worse in some cases at thinking about our own mental states than other people's mental states. I'm talking about belief information, right? That even though it feels like we have direct introspective access to the contents of our minds, when we're asked to represent our mental states qua mental states, that might actually be a little bit challenging for us. And the reason is that we're not used to doing it, right? So when you and I are having conversation, I am spontaneously, maybe implicitly updating my model of what you're thinking, what you're gonna say next, whether how you're responding to what I'm saying, whereas I'm not constantly updating my model of my own mind. I don't need to predict what I'm going to do. I don't need to understand what I'm doing. I don't need to, maybe most importantly, judge whether I'm friend or enemy, right? And these are all very natural inputs to making those kinds of moral judgments and engaging in regular social interactions. So we have a few hints of evidence suggesting that we're actually worse at thinking about our own mental states in both sort of very neutral contexts, but also moral contexts as well.
Well, couldn't one source of that be that, again, to get back to maybe biases that may be designed into the mind by natural selection, it's in my interest to depict myself as a good person. So when I do good things, I want to think that they reflect on my character, and I want to convince the world of that. And when I do bad things, I want to think it's because I didn't get my nap today, and I want to convince the world of that. So it's natural that there would be a dispositional versus situational bias in the way we talk about our own behavior, right?
For sure. But let me say that we're actually finding the opposite pattern so far, at least in one context. And these are very preliminary data. So the hypothesis is that if I am less good at reasoning about my own mental states, including my own intentions and beliefs, then I will actually be harsher on myself in some instances. And one example of that would be the case of accidental harm. So if I hurt you accidentally because I accidentally put poison in your coffee and you got sick, then I'm going to be harsher on myself because I'm thinking less about the fact that I didn't mean to do it and more about the fact that you got sick. Right? So I'm focused on the external world around me and my effects on my external environment, namely you, than what I meant to do. And then my friend could tell me, look, you didn't mean to poison Bob. You would have had no way of knowing that, that packet of sugar was actually poisonous. And so that's the asymmetry that we're hypothesizing. Okay. We have some hints of evidence there. And then in another case, having nothing to do with moral judgment, where we actually plant false beliefs into people's heads by giving them pictures that are misleading. So I ask you what a part of a picture looks like. It looks like a soccer ball. I show you the whole thing. It turns out to be a turtle. And then I ask you after the fact, right, after a long period of time, about what you thought each of those part images were. That's in one condition. And then another group of subjects get the same sort of stimuli, but this time they see someone else go through this task. So they see a false belief being developed in someone else's head, and then they have to remember what that person thought. And there seems to be some asymmetry in people's accuracy at remembering their own false beliefs versus other people's false beliefs, whether they were right or wrong to begin with.
So in the first case, the accidental poisoning of the coffee, you're not wrong about. In a sense, it's not the attribution you're wrong about. You're not convincing yourself you did it intentionally when you did it accidentally. That part you're right. You're clear exactly. on, but you're chastising yourself for the accident.
Exactly.
And, I mean, I'd have. I guess a couple of kinds of theories there. One would be, like, especially if it's a friend and you almost killed them, it's in your interest to, like, take that seriously, like, don't do it again. The other is that if you're going to talk to the friend, it's in your interest to apologize deeply. And the best way to apologize deeply is to feel, at least at that moment, like you really did something wrong, even though you're not confused about the motivation, but it was a serious screw up.
Yeah, exactly. So there are two interesting things to note there. The first is that your response could very, very much depend on the context. So, if you are on trial for hurting someone by accident, then you might very well appeal to your innocent intentions. And I think that's the case. And that's when you're starting to see yourself from a third-party perspective, and not just interacting with your friend and not just focused on the fact that you almost killed your friend. Now, what's interesting to point out is that the stakes are pretty high for your friend too, right? So it'd be interesting to see whether you sort of represent your own mental states less spontaneously compared to your friend or compared to your friend's friend, right? So sort of the intuitive example that I was giving was that my friend might say, hey, look, like, don't beat yourself up over this. There's no way that you could have known, right? So it's probably in my friend's interest to also make sure that this thing never happens again, right? Because they don't want to be poisoned by me either. So why would we see this asymmetry, right, outside of these reasons having to do with motivated cognition?
Okay. Now, there was another paper you did called The Paradox of Moral Focus, and just one sentence caught my attention in the abstract. It said, when we judge an agent to have acted immorally, we are subsequently more likely to judge the agent to have acted freely, not under force. So how did that work? Did you first just see whether their judgment was that the person had done something immoral, or did you do something to kind of encourage that judgment, or what?
So this work builds on a lot of work in philosophy and also some more contemporary work in empirical philosophy, suggesting again that moral judgments have a really powerful effect on our other kinds of judgments. So causal judgments, judgments of force and freedom, judgments of mental states like intentions and beliefs, and so on. And so in this particular paper, what we wanted to show was not just that our moral judgments influence our judgments of force and freedom, but that they do so in this really weird sort of way that results in subjects saying things like, Bob forced Leanne, but Leanne was not forced by Bob. So the idea would be that, and again, this is a case from Aristotle, where you're the captain of a ship and your ship is about to sink in the middle of a big storm. In order to save your ship from sinking, you throw a bunch of cargo overboard. Were you forced to throw the cargo overboard? And most people say, sure, you were forced to throw the cargo overboard as the captain of the ship, trying to save your ship. And then what happens is that if you change the scenario so that you replace the cargo with the captain's wife and you ask subjects, was he forced to throw his wife overboard? Nobody says he was forced to throw the wife, right? Surely there were other options. Surely there were other alternative approaches to saving the ship in that instance. So we looked at these sorts of cases, right? But this time we added a second agent, right? So the captain forced the sailor to throw the cargo overboard, or the captain forced the sailor to throw the passenger overboard, right? So what we're seeing here is that in the case of an immoral action, the captain exerts a lot of force on the sailor to make him do something immoral. So the captain forced the sailor to throw the passenger overboard. Feels like the captain was very forceful in that situation. But then when we focus subjects' attention on the sailor, it seems like he wasn't forced to throw the passenger overboard. He could have disobeyed the captain. He could have found another solution to the problem, right? So that's where we find subjects being stuck in saying, again, A forced B, but B wasn't forced by A. And this is part of a broader pattern of findings, again, showing that morality can influence our judgments of non-moral inputs. And I think this should matter, right? Because like we were saying before, typically, if I want to figure out whether you're a friend or enemy, I need to do that by figuring out whether you did what you did intentionally or by accident, whether you actually were the causal source of what happened, and so on, whether you had a gun to your head when you did that. So it's interesting that this relationship is bidirectional.
Yeah. So it seems to me that on the basis of that experiment alone, the inferences are a little complicated. You could go a number of ways, and maybe it'll become a whole field of research and narrow the options down. But one thing it could suggest is just this broader thing that's been a theme here, kind of, which is that you might think that the way the mind works in making moral judgments is first you say, did that person have any alternative other than to do something unfortunate that led to the death of someone? And if they didn't have that option, then you're less inclined to judge them as immoral. But it could work the other way, which is that we have other reasons, maybe whether it's a friend or enemy, and that doesn't apply in this case, but that we have other reasons for wanting to reach a conclusion about someone's moral guilt or moral innocence, and then we adjust our estimate of their motivation accordingly to justify that. I mean, I don't think you can quite say that on the basis of this experiment, but that's where some of this stuff seems to be headed.
Yeah, no, absolutely. There already is a whole domain of literature on just this topic, on whether people are sort of motivated to discount, other sorts of factors because of their moral judgments or vice versa. So I'll tell you about one study that we did suggesting that there has to be some influence of moral judgment on assessments of intentions. Or at least suggestive evidence. So we ran a study where subjects played an economic game with a bunch of other participants, right? So I think this was either a dictator and ultimatum game where they were being treated either fairly or unfairly by other people, right? So other people were given $10 and they had to split the money between themselves and our subjects, and they either offered them $5 or $3 or $2 or some other sum of money. And then after they had interacted with these fair and unfair players, they were told that these other players had written stories about things that they had done in the past that were either vaguely good or vaguely bad, but those stories were stripped of any information having to do with intention. So and put in third person. So Dorothy dyed her roommate's sweater red, right? Or she shrunk the sweater, she broke her roommate's favorite vase, and so on. And then subjects had to guess whether those actions were intentional or accidental, and they also had to make moral judgments of those actions as well. And they wrote the same stories about their own actions to make the setup a little bit more believable, because of course those weren't real people. And then they were scanned as they made these judgments. So we scanned their brains as they made these judgments about the people. And what we found was that, and this part isn't so surprising, is that when they read the stories of the behaviors of the people who had acted unfairly towards them in the game, they judged those bad actions as both more blameworthy and more intentional. We then looked at those same brain regions that we're talking about before for theory of mind and mental state reasoning to see how those regions responded. And what we saw was a bump up in activity in those theory of mind brain regions for those bad actions that subjects attributed to unfair players. But that bump up in neural activity happened after the moral judgment, right? So what the data suggest is that subjects interacted with people who screwed them over in the game. They then judged those bad actions as more blameworthy and more intentional, right, after the fact, and that is reflected in that extra boost of neural activity tracking with their assessment of the bad intent.
And so we already knew from prior work what the function of that part of the brain was, what increased neural activity signified?
Yeah, exactly. So we're making a sort of reverse inference here based on a lot of other work suggesting that what this brain region does, and again, this is the region that I was telling you about before that seems to show a different pattern of activity in people with autism, right? That this brain region is part of this network that does theory of mind, and it's particularly selective for this cognitive process.
Okay.
Yeah. But again, I mean, there's a lot of research in this area, and I think both directions are certainly in place, right? We think about mental states to make moral judgments, of course, and then there are other instances where moral judgments seem to influence how we think about mental states.
Okay. Has all of this left you at all discouraged about, I mean, like when you think about something like the criminal justice system, and juries deciding about the guilt or innocence of people. I mean, there's a lot of factors other than impartial assessment that come into play in all of this, right?
For sure. For sure. I mean, there are many reasons to be discouraged at the moment, but one thing that we've looked at recently, which may be more discouraging than some of the other things that we've looked at, is this phenomenon of victim blame across a number of different contexts, right? And victim blaming, interestingly, seems to be linked to people's moral values and moral principles in an interesting way. So,
Right.
Where we started was cases of sexual assault. So thinking, why is it that in so many cases of sexual assault, we wonder about the alternatives available to the victim, right? So going back to counterfactual thinking, right? Like, could the captain have done anything else? Could the sailor have done anything else to save the ship, right? Could the rape victim have done anything else to prevent what happened? Why don't we think counterfactually about the violator, the perpetrator, right? And so we started out just by looking at people's judgments of how contaminated versus injured the victim is of a crime. So sexual assault and non-sexual crimes as well. And what we saw, which was really interesting, was that, well, first of all, the not so surprising finding is that people think of sexual assault victims as maybe more contaminated than they think of victims of non-sexual crimes. But the other interesting thing we found was that there's a negative correlation between the injury ratings and the contamination ratings. So if you're the kind of person who thinks of a rape victim as contaminated, you're also the kind of person to think that a rape victim is not very injured. So it's not the case that you just think all kinds of negative outcomes are similar. If they're more contaminated, they're also more injured, and all around it's a more tragic event, right? That's not the case. The other surprising thing we found was that this effect is related to people's moral values. So we're talking before about different kinds of moral values, right? So say fairness and justice versus loyalty. There are certain moral values that are aimed towards building and binding groups together. The kinds of moral values that Paul Bloom talks about as being related to empathy, right? Mm-hmm. These are the values that maybe he thinks are not so legitimate and maybe a little bit insidious, right? The kinds of values that lead to empathy for people who are close to you. Those are the kinds of moral values that actually predict how contaminated you find victims to be. And not just contaminated, but also how much you think victims are responsible for what happened and how you think counterfactually about victims, what they could have done or should have done differently in the case of the crime. So in some sense, that might lead to solutions, I hope, to this phenomenon of victim blaming once we figure out some of the sort. And of course, victim blaming is incredibly complicated. So there are probably many different influences and factors. Mm-hmm. But this seems to be one factor: moral values.
And is this related to John Haidt's work on, the values he sees correlated with political conservatives as opposed to liberals, where the conservatives, it's more about, I guess, purity and loyalty and so on?
Yeah, absolutely. This very much builds on his work, and we use the Moral Foundations questionnaire to measure people's moral values in this study. What we found, though, was that even though political orientation is linked to moral values, political orientation does not account for this phenomenon of victim blaming that we're finding. It's the problem seems to be rooted in the moral values, not in the politics.
So you managed to disentangle those variables.
Yeah, that seems to be the pattern that we're finding in this data. Yeah.
So
yeah.
So if you correct for kind of political ideology or whatever,
exactly, we still see that moral values account for this kind of victim blaming. Okay. Yeah. I mean, moral values are complicated, and I think one of the things that we're all starting to find is that there are very different kinds of moral contexts, whether we're talking about purity in the case of sexual assault or harm in the case of other common crimes, and that people can reason very differently. Even in the case of fundamental attribution error, what we were talking about before with assessments of force and freedom, people make different assessments of those depending on the nature of the crime.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, listen, this has been fascinating. Your work, I could talk for hours and hours about your work. And if people are interested, they can obviously Google your name, Liane Young. And for people who are listening on podcast rather than watching, that's Liane Young. And probably if they Google the Morality Lab, is that the name of your group there at Boston College?
That's right.
And is there anything else? Do you have a Twitter feed or anything you want to publicize?
Nope.
Nothing at all. Well, very humble.
No book, no Twitter. Yeah.
Very humble, non-self-promotional researcher. We need more Americans like you. Okay. Well, thanks so much, and maybe we'll have occasion to talk down the road. I hope so.
Thank you. That was a lot of fun.
Okay. Bye-bye.